Good morning. Here you see my title. It's Salomo Friedlander, The Polarity Principle, Creative Indifference, and the Revolution of Egoism. It's a pleasure to be addressing you today. And I can build up partly on what Nancy told us and also partly of what Bob has told us. My topic is here, what did Fritz Perls adopt from Salomo Friedlander, and what does it mean for Gestalt therapy? Previously, in 1996, I presented a keynote lecture at the EAGT conference in Prague, so it's a long time ago. My topic was Gestalt therapy as an approach to a complex theory of human health and disease. Here in Budapest, I would like to link the two topics. I will complement this with reflections on the opposite pole of reason and conclude with a look at Gestalt therapy in the context of the global situation. These are my chapters. Chapter 1. The influence of Friedlander's Polarity Principle on Fritz Perls and Gestalt therapy. As I told you, I can keep this short because of Nancy. I start with Friedlander's two main works and a few photos. This is Friedlander. Searching for Friedlander's name in philosophical works, in philosophical dictionaries, is a futile undertaking. The editor of his works, Hartmut Gerken, writes, because of his expulsion, it could not come to light that he was an active fermenting agent. For instance, for Einstein, for numerous discussions that remain important today. He was involved in the debates about Kant and Einstein. There is Salomo Friedlander written on the forehead of Einstein. Defended Goethe's theory of colors, provided psychologist Fritz Perls the basis for his Gestalt therapy. He in his old age with his wife. Friedlander's concern, creating clarity in our minds. Since the beginning of the modern age, we have been living with a schism of knowledge between the natural sciences and the humanities. Transcendence and science are considered incompatible. Knowledge of detail has been overemphasized, which resulted in general disorientation with regard to life as a meaningful context. Consequently, it might make sense to review our private epistemology. What is the best way for me as an individual to orient myself in the cognitively comprehensible world? During his lifetime, Fritz Perls perceived this as an urgent concern. Much like many others of his generation, he had been confronted with nationalistic delusions and experienced how they resulted in two world wars. He was now looking for truthfulness and the meaning of life in philosophy. Perls was very much impressed with Friedlander's personality and his basic conviction that philosophy means creating order. By reading this, I have always to think of Burko in the British Parliament, who says, order, order, order. It's very important to keep order in one's mind. For him, creative indifference offered the most conclusive orientation because it permits an observer to have the least distorted view. To this day, our Western tradition continues to suggest that we understand differences as opposites that are mutually exclusive. Believers or unbelievers, citizens or foreigners, spirit, or matter. This is a legacy of Manichaeism. In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, it split the world into light and darkness. That's our heritage. Friedlander's thunderstorm of reason, polarities instead of opposites. Friedlander's magnificent contribution lies in its suggestion that as individuals we should actively engage with the usual contradictions and redefine them as poles. As an example, making a decision for a self-sufficient individual on the one hand, or for dependency on the other, for aggression or for empathy, we can take a position where we intellectually remain in the middle. Friedlander uses negative and positive numbers as an analogy. He recognizes that the zero is actually the counting person herself, for without a person who is counting, numbers make no sense. Likewise, the many opposites do not make sense without a thinking human being to experience them. The alignment of Gestalt therapy with Friedlander's Polarity Principle. Fritz Perls pointed out that the respective context must be taken into account when polarizing in order to find the appropriate counterpole. His profound understanding can be seen as well in the fact that he also uses the term pre-difference, which is to say existing prior to all difference. How often Perls has been accused of calling for reason to be ignored. His dictum, lose your mind and come to your senses, was regarded as proof. If one understands mind as meaning introjects, then Perls' demand expresses exactly what Husserl also wanted, that we should set aside traditional views and give precedence to sensual experience. The polarity principle is also extremely productive as a principle for constructing theory. Perls came to the conclusion that the different schools of psychology manifest a lack of integration. Consequently, he wanted his work to be a contribution to an integrated theory, meant to encompass all physical, mental, and emotional phenomena. Friedlander's method would help to formulate a holistic theory of the human being. The first chapter of part 1 of Ego, Hunger, and Aggression bears the title Differential Thinking. This becomes the basis for Perls' theory formation and of Gestalt therapy theory itself. Mental and emotional balancing as a basic model for the practice of Gestalt therapy. I have shortened this also because of Nancy's speech. Indifference and the Taoist Wu Wei are principles that promote emotional balance and mental equilibrium. In Gestalt therapy, acting from the center of the person in the middle mode, in conjunction with all of the senses, is regarded as a sign of a mature personality and as a therapeutic potential. Neutrality enables us not to become entangled in the value judgments and perspectives that the person under our care may learn to identify as unhelpful or even toxic. In addition to the person-to-person relationship based on empathy, formal concepts such as figure ground formation, the context cycle, the open gestalt, and the paradoxical theory of change are characteristic instruments. They make it possible to train the self-perception of clients so that they learn to understand their convictions, emotions, and body sensations better and to work and to work on overcoming their problems as consequences of inadequate Gestalt formation. Interrupting of contact cycles or open gestalts, for instance, by rewinding the film to relevant situations according to epigenetics, what we know today, or by offering bodywork or with artistic means. As Laura Pearls described it, the focus of Gestalt therapy is the continuum of consciousness, freely developing Gestalt formation, in which what is most important and interesting for the organism, the relationship, the group, or society becomes the figure. Every fixed Gestalt becomes a blockage over time and exists in the present. We can use our own resonance, which come up as simultaneous Gestalt formations, which can help us to act in a sensitive way. The client's conflicts in their life world can often be traced to introjects of cultural traditions that represent the dominant pole. The client may now experience the opposite pole as well. Experiencing the 0 point ensures that convictions, emotions, and body sensations can be transformed. The former narrowness of the mind may expand. The decreasing need for support and a relationship on equal terms are indications of successful development. I now go on to Friedlander's second main work, The Magical Eye, which he understood as his real best work. It is not well known in Gestalt therapy. Chapter 2, Friedlander's active ego. The ability to polarize involves our thinking. Where does it take place, this thinking? Friedlander was exposed to Immanuel Kant, which motivated him to write this second main work, through his teacher Ernst Marcus. Kant's a priori ego provided an answer. Kant had shed light on the polarity concept. Friedlander did not hesitate to enrich Kant's a priori with his polarization. Kant's a priori organism, Kant revolutionized philosophy by discovering that every experience is determined by its form, and that the form is determined by the ego. Kant calls it the center of the a priori organism. It can only perceive through differentiation. He referenced David Hume. We almost automatically interpret sequences of events as cause and effect. Kant concluded that reason, with its categories, is predetermined as our discriminating consciousness. The tremendous amount of work it performs comes to light only when we direct the search towards consciousness itself. The ego only determines the form and not the content. It uses categories such as space, time, and causality to order the multiplicity of perceptions into a meaningful whole. Since Kant, we realize the external world is shaped by our perception. Friedlander uses the analogy of a firefly. It does not realize that the light illuminating its surrounding is coming from itself. According to Friedlander in The Magical Eye, Kant's concept of the multiplicity of experiences is not sufficient, however. To fully grasp the active role of the ego requires Friedlander's formula of polarity and indifference. Some statements evoke associations with Gestalt psychology. For instance, the ego registers sensory differences and immediately forces arise that not only accept the differences, but also unifies them. Kant's a priori ego transforms everything it experiences into its object. This reminds me of Husserl's intentionality. It also relates to the activities of the person, not only the perceptions, but also the activities. This is very important, and this we find also in philosophical pragmatism. Chapter 3, the theory of Gestalt therapy as a coherent whole, based on the principle of polarity, on the paradigm of holism, and on Gestalt psychology. Fritz Perls' idea was to integrate all of the sciences that affect human life: the theory of evolution, physics, chemistry, ecology, biology, medicine, system theory, cybernetics, sociology, and philosophy. Gestalt therapy, along with psychology, neuroscience, and medicine, could enable us to construct an integrated theory of so-called mental and somatic disorders. It also includes a socio-psychological understanding of these. This requires a comprehensive view of the human being. Correspondingly, the healing potential is far-reaching. Jan Christian Smuts' book, Holism and Evolution, can be considered a supplement to Friedlander's philosophy. Casting the theory of evolution as the connection of all phenomena on Earth was a masterstroke of integration. Unfortunately, Smuts as well as Goldstein were repeatedly misunderstood, as if they strove to downgrade human beings to the merely biological understanding, to the merely biological or even just matter. On the contrary, the theory of evolution opens a comprehensive understanding of nature, ultimately encompassing mental phenomena. Fritz Perls speaks of the wisdom of individual cells. They may know more than our arrogance allows us to suspect. They know their needs. Goldstein's concept of the organism speaks of human beings as body, mind, spirit entities. This is to portray humankind in a way that surmounts the separation of human beings from the natural basis of their lives. Instead of creating confusion from which endless problems but no solutions emerge. Goldstein states the fundamental relationality of life on this earth as the co-evolution of ecological relationships. To limit relationality to the relationship between two individuals is to rip human beings out of this deep source of their existence. Now a word also to field theory. Fritz and Laura Perls also take up Goldstein's concept Goldstein's concept of organismic self-regulation. In combination with Levin's field theory, this resulted in the concept of the organism-environment field. In my mind, this has led to a widespread misunderstanding of Levin's field concept. He transferred Einstein's concept into social psychology. Here, the subject of research is the behavior and action of a particular person and specific causal connections. Behavior B is a function of the person P and the environment E at a given time. You see this formula of Levin. that means that each individual defines a specific field from his/her own perspective and interest in a certain time. Field is not defined as a collection of interacting people in their environment. There is no impersonal actor like a supra-individual field or between, who would be the instance to make the relevant observation. Every individual has to cope with their own perceptions and, not to forget, has an individual responsibility, except in a collective trance or confluency. So I think that today the term field is used as a metaphor and not a precisely defined term. Maybe Einstein would show his time. So I've built a model of the person's relation in a generalized environment. I cannot read through all this. Important is the factor time is included here. Oh yeah, the factor time is here included. I make difference between natural environment and social environment. Personal existence is not possible without contact to and relationships with the natural and social world. The contact of the a priori ego, or we say our individual consciousness, with possibly all aspects of the person, is the prerequisite for self-knowledge. Laura Pearl states, Gestalt therapy deals with the obvious that is immediately available to the conscious mind. We have to accept that the client is able to deal with and willing to, we have to accept what the client is able to deal with and willing to assimilate. The question, who is right, the therapist or the client, may be relevant to psychoanalytical interpretations. In Gestalt therapy, there is no necessity to answer it. The central momentum of Gestalt therapy, in my mind, is the manifestation and the development of the client's a priori organism, of the whole organism and its consciousness, organizing him/herself in a complex environment. The focus lies on the difficulties of the person to master one's life. Laura Pearls states, the fixed gestalts involve personal, social, and scientific developments. Contact is not to limit to the interpersonal level. The contact cycle means, how Laura Pearl says it, a superordinate concept for dealing with the environment. By perceptions, emotions, communications, and actions. That takes into account the dimension of time and whether a gestalt was closed or not. I come now to Gestalt psychology. Ego, hunger, and aggression is dedicated to Wertheimer. Gestalt psychology is designated as the appropriate psychological theory in the first chapter of part 1 of Ego, Hunger, and Aggression. By this, both Laura and Fritz Perls concurred with the scientific innovations of their time. Tokafondi in the last years found out if one looks at the reception of Gestalt psychology in the scientific literature of the 20th century, there is no possible orientation, how to locate it. Gestalt psychology was interpreted very differently and even completely opposite. My suggestion is to associate Gestalt theory with Kant's philosophy. Fritz Perls already had the premonition that the call to pursue a more in-depth theoretical discussion could create resistance among those interested in practical psychology. He probably foresaw a basic problem in conveying the theory of Gestalt therapy, yet he clearly extended an invitation. The practical value of these ideas will reveal itself only if one tracks their repeated application. Nevertheless, from the beginning, the reader should at least be acquainted with their rough structure. I will now turn to presenting a model of a draft of such a structure, a draft of the theory of Gestalt therapy as a coherent whole. I start. This is a fourth of the whole. I go on then. And if you imagine as a counterpole a lady's handbag where you stuff in the individual things you need at a time and take out some of the others. So I present this instead of a lady's handbag. The different concepts are arranged according to scientific disciplines and levels of complexity, from philosophy to the various sciences and to practice. Let me recall also Einstein's admonition. Beware of distorting the comprehension of the whole by isolating individual facts or through blurred or forcible abstractions. Due to time constraints, I can only show you one after another the PowerPoint slides. The link between all of them, what they have in common, is Gestalt formation and self-organization. Just for a first impression, and as a supplement, medicine unto modern physics, we can add today quantum information theory may be a foundation for predifference in polarity and a foundation for a theory of consciousness. And what I want to underline, there is no end to integration into this complex theory, what it was from the beginning. Now, I leave this field and go to another chapter 4, the counterpole of reason. I want to apply Friedlander's polarizing on reason itself and made some deliberations about the counterpole. Friedlander's approach holds out the promise of overcoming thinking in opposites. Yet he encountered difficulties in applying polarization in individual cases. A difficult example is truth. What is the counterpole of truth? Truth, here you see on the left side, the point of indifference in the middle, and on the right side, is it lie or error? As the opposite pole to truth, the concept of error does not seem to pose any difficulties. The concept of lying certainly does. I experienced myself in a motion from truth to the point of indifference. Approaching this point of indifference causes me to experience dizziness. Schwindel in German. In German, Schwindel also means deceit or self-deceit. Clients who suffered from physical dizziness usually answered yes when I asked them whether there was any deceit, Schwindel, in their lives. Ultimately, that had led to a resolution of their symptoms. ethical action and pathology. Ernst Marcus, Friedlander's mentor, already referred to this phenomenon. He suspected that actions associated with the sensing of defective self-organization have a disruptive effect on health. Ethical doubts would produce the same effect. This makes the relationship between psyche and soma plausible. Incoherent gestalts create unsolvable tasks for the brain and, as a result, stress. In today's world, this is a sensitive issue when it comes to our democracies, where the boundaries between right and wrong, true and false, are becoming increasingly blurred in politics and business. This applies not only to institutions, but also to those who tag along. The sense of consonance and the good Gestalt. Wertheimer argues that the traditional notion of Homo sapiens contains a sense of truth and honesty. However, there are forces that oppose this. Even events and actions can be logical or illogical, as the old phrase inner necessity implies. Nowadays, philosopher Bettina Stangnet describes Kant's a priori ego in a way that approaches Gestalt psychology. It manifests as an eminent sense of consonance and dissonance in relation to ourselves. We feel it when thoughts and judgments are incompatible, when our desires and ideas do not align with reality, it's as if someone were talking about dry rain. Human reason cannot contribute anything to moral action other than precisely this law of consonance. A gestalt is either coherent or not. We cannot consider honesty a necessity and at the same time behave differently without feeling it. Wertheimer's law of the good Gestalt acts not only as an aesthetic law, but can also be felt as an ethical law. Therefore, the law of the good Gestalt is also suitable to understand a priori's ego more precisely, or better today to say our consciousness. Evil thinking counter to reason. In philosophy, attention has rarely been paid to unrighteous thinking. Nietzsche was one of the few to examine lies. Hannah Arendt drew on Adolf Eichmann in her attempt to understand the banality of evil. And Stangnet asks whether evil thinking exists in society and politics in a general sense. This seems to be very important if we really want to understand humanity, and perhaps some of our clients as well, and our political macroclimate. Our perceptions of the human being may be beautiful and lofty, but they are not realistic to a one-to-one scale. Moral law is only one driver of several. Our freedom is expressed in the fact that our own insight into this law not necessarily determines our actions. Kant was already aware of this. He assumed that the development of mankind would be painful until the ultimate decision in favor of reason was reached. This hypothesis facilitates the understanding of the dark chapters of human history, as well as the future pain we may have to expect due to the climate crisis. Kant hoped that states would shoulder their responsibility, that education would make children respect reason and consciously apply it. The rule of law, universal education, and keeping the whole of humanity closely in view, This all would form a solid foundation. Oh, yeah. Okay. Kant could not have imagined that worldviews and sciences would later be devised that allow self-reflection and individual responsibility no longer be taken seriously, that educated people could lose interest in verified information and science. At present, skepticism against the Enlightenment project has reached an alarming level. Backward-looking attitudes increase in the neglected strata of the population, where they are often linked to a rejection of all self-control. Philosophizing against reason, the new phenomenology of Hermann Schmitz. Unfortunately, part of the Gestalt community is viewing the new phenomenology of Hermann Schmitz as an appropriate complement to Gestalt therapy. Schmitz makes the absurd claim that we have a purely material body that can only be measured, and a spiritual life with so-called corporeal islands that can be experienced only from the inside. He throws us back to our brainstem and tries to reintroduce an extreme form of mind-body dualism. In the center of his philosophy, we also find supra-individual entities. Human beings are understood to expose to supra-individual atmospheres and feelings which overrule the individual's perceptions. Individual responsibility is therefore declared obsolete. Consequently, Schmitz denies Kant's work and denigrates Jewish intellectuality. He completely ignores Goldstein's concept of the organism. I have to mention that Goldstein was a Jew because in 1999 Hermann Schmitz published a book on Hitler in which he agrees with Hitler, who, citation, whatever he saw, wherever he saw the principle of mechanical leveling uniformity asserting itself, he believes he has caught Jews in the act. It is horrifying that a contemporary German philosopher could write something like that. It is necessary to examine the lucidity of our concepts and the context from which we draw our innovations. Please allow me to refer to the panel discussion on this topic in the afternoon. It was organized by Nancy Amadline. You'll find it in the list. So I come near to the end, but not yet. I am there. Social and political conditions and our own responsibility. It is important to recognize that the world we all live in today is the result of the convictions and intentions of all past and present human beings, and especially to identify the undesirable developments that have been caused by traditions of dualistic thinking. Right now, it is experiencing a renaissance and leads to schisms and negative projections. People are categorized into citizens and immigrants, whites and blacks, men and women, heterosexuals and homosexuals, Christians and Muslims, the elite and the masses, the center and the periphery. The unspoken assumption here is that the second part of each pair is inferior to the first. Often those inferiorized strata of society experience significant disadvantage, catastrophic impoverishment, or even violence and murder. Nothing triggers greater fear than the expectation of institutionalized cruelty. It makes a lived democracy impossible. The public denigration of regime critics must also be seen as a danger and monitored. Public and private thinking must be re-examined. I would like to end this chapter with a quote by Laura Pearls. When you work with people on thinking for themselves, that is political work. Now a short chapter to Friedlander's Revolution of Egoism, thinking deeper than reason. This is another quality. Through repetition, polarization can become a path to inner equilibrium and depth, and to connection with being in a general sense. The laws of the cosmos from which we have emerged may become perceptible here. The mind becomes quiet and completely new aspects suddenly arise. In quantum theory, we encounter a parallel phenomenon. Our system of logic is not suited to understand the depth of physical reality, which defies dual logic and cannot be exclusively defined as either a particle or a wave. The paradoxical surmounting of egoism through creative expression. Friedlander wanted to bring about a revolution in the concept of egoism. He demanded that we connect with our deepest inner being and thereby tame the egoistic part of us. He believed that human beings share in the universal creative principle, for their deepest essence corresponds to the original principles that created this world. People who have relearned to experience themselves as a holistic organism may experience merging into being in the moment as transcendence. Peirce described himself when he was intensely engaged with a person, a thing, or an artistic task in the following manner. When I am at work, I'm not Fritz Perls. I become nothing, no thing, a catalyst. Friedlander claims that people could be freer in their actions if they realized that they carry this potential deep within themselves. It is the task of individual human beings to express themselves precisely by the art of wanting from one's innermost core. This is an expression of the laws of the cosmos. Laura Pearl spoke of individual uniqueness, Friedlander on the unadulterated uniqueness of the individual human being. I think we have a very impressive example now in Greta Thunberg. What we are experiencing today in the worldwide climate protests of pupils, students, and many others is the merging of self-interest and altruism becoming a reality at a higher level. The survival of the individual, of all human beings and all living beings and on the earth is a single mental and emotional gestalt. Conclusion, Friedlander's philosophy, is an illustration for feeling oneself as a creator. So, conclusion, Friedlander's philosophy as an impulse for designing the theory of Gestalt therapy as a holistic concept. In the Gestalt community, there seem to be tendencies to ignore Gestalt concepts and move back in the direction of psychoanalysis. This leads to a kind of talking cure inspired by Buber and postmodern philosophy. Yet our approach is called Gestalt therapy and not encounter therapy. Bednarek recently expressed her concern. I believe that there is some urgency in Gestalt therapy, raising its profile and finding its distinctive voice in the growing chorus. And Robinson came to this conclusion: Gestalt therapy needs a clear philosophy. we must beware that without our core concepts, we cannot retain the individual uniqueness of our method. A fragmentation into various approaches has already begun, in analogy to psychoanalysis, which Peirce had commented like this. The great number of schools developed in a few decades of psychoanalysis proved the incompleteness or insufficiency of this system. In other new branches of sciences, the development of new schools was either negligible or reconciliation resulted in a unified line of research. We should keep in mind, that's what Bob also said yesterday, we should keep in mind that science has to reduce the variability of possible explanations. Laura Peirce had rejected compound propositions such as Gestalt therapy and movement, like this. Probably she would also not be happy adding adjectives such as relational, because this amounts to carrying coal to Newcastle, because relational is inherent in the basic Gestalt concepts. The relational Gestalt therapy approach is based on the fact that some egocentric therapists in the 1960s were triggering shame in patients. That was described by Yontef. Can this be reason enough to design a special approach of Gestalt therapy? In my mind, no. And the polarity perspective suggests that Gestalt therapy without the specification relational could be understood as the counterpole, a practice that advocates egocentric behavior. Another approach, dialogical Gestalt therapy, is viewing only human relationships as important. There are no relationships to the world. The holistic perspective is not implemented. Nature does not matter. This approach seems to isolate itself from the world, as Bednarek describes it. She attributes this anthropocentric world view to capitalism. In my opinion, the complete context is wider than this. The principle humanity stands above all else stems from the European religious tradition. It demands subdue the earth. Together with the neoliberal motto of the winner takes it all, it describes the goal of our economies. Missionaries and merchants eradicated the natural religions of the so-called primitives and subdued the peoples. Only men, as the image of God, are supposedly entitled to rule over nature. The female principle was extinguished by the sheer fact that there is only a male God. The consequences of not paying attention to Mother Nature can no longer be overlooked. Today, Trump is supported by the Tea Party. Bolsonaro, who is allowing the green lung of the earth to go up in smoke, is supported by evangelical free churches, and autocrats like Putin and some other European leaders are supported by their national churches. Religious fundamentalists are sowing violence and dividing the peoples. The overall importance of Friedlander's polarization cure in today's world. Now I really come to an end. I would like to emphasize again the social and political relevance of Friedlander's polarity principle, especially in current times when dualistic fundamentalist and even totalitarian thinking is once again spreading into a wide range of violent phenomena. It cannot be sufficient to settle in comfortably behind the screen of a humanistic image of the human being, where only empathy exists. Friedlander discovered a method for distancing ourselves from harmful cultural legacies and for subjecting our intellectual repertoire of traditional worldviews, convictions, ideologies, and religious belief to a polarization cure. When such fixations are transformed, we may move through life with our minds and hearts more open than before. Today we are experiencing a tremendous ecological crisis that could plunge us into a post-human age. The existence of the entire natural world is at stake. Here we should ultimately also remember Paul Goodman, who saw the principles of self-organization at work in nature as a whole and wanted them to be applied in society and politics as well. As an anarchist, he also reminded us that our nature needs freedom. He wanted to promote the formation of small groups in order to counteract the actions of big business. He wanted to strengthen our democracies through the concrete self-administration of communities. He worked in the spirit of the ecological age, which must now dawn if our species is to survive, rather than plunging all other species into ruin. We must recall to mind Gestalt therapy as a whole. Today, as we face the climate crisis, the described core concepts have to become vivid and finally, as fear for our future, palpable. Those intellectual principles have nothing to do with emotional coldness. They can help us to consciously develop our freedom within their framework, as well as all the potential of our humanity and our antennas for transcendence. In this way, we can also meet our clients at the point where they find themselves in their development and help them move to where their individuality and their life energies in contact with the world are drawing them. Thank you for your attention.